Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beach Blitz Day 4. This morning, we got started with our elimination rounds for our mini-bot competition, and we finally crowned a winner. Congratulations to Team 5199 again for winning the entire mini-bot competition. We also handed out some great awards to teams for both the Scouting Hackathon and the mini-bot competition. A special shout out to all the volunteers who made that work, to all the judges, the refs, and a special shout out to Nikki and to Tegan for their stream. It was a lot of fun, and I know I enjoyed watching it. I'm looking forward to seeing your team ups in the future. Today, we're going to get started with our workshops, starting off with Rachel Lim, who will be teaching Introduction to Numerical Scouting Methods. I'm sure you've seen Rachel all over Chief Delphi. She has amazing, like 10 amazing posts a day, and they're also insightful and teach a lot. So I'm looking forward to seeing what I can learn from this. So Rachel, take it away.
Hi, thanks. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Rachel Lim. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an 1868 alum. Since then, I've mentored teams 5199, helped out my old team a bit, and most recently been with team 1072, mostly with design, scouting, and strategy. Today I'm going to be diving into the world of numerical scouting, which includes stuff like OpR, ELO, and other stuff around that. So some background before I get started. So I guess going back to the very beginning, why do we scout? And I think there's really two things here. We need scouting data so that we can form match strategies. This helps us both figure out a goal for the match. We try to win, get bonus ranking points, a lot less occasionally, maximize tiebreaker points, such as Cargo in 2019. Scouting data helps us understand how we maximize our alliance points or minimize our opponent's points. So do you have a team play defense? Which team should do which auto? If two teams have the same auto, which one is more reliable and which team should run it? That kind of stuff. Similarly, we need this data for alliance selection. The alliance selections, I think, are a little bit different because you sort of have your goal going in. You either know you're going to try and win the event, or for regional teams, sometimes you're just trying to make finals to qualify. But scouting data helps you figure out the easiest bracket to that goal. So building the strongest alliance, as well as occasionally declining or picking a team below you to help your way through the bracket. And the key to this is you need to accurately know what teams are capable of and how reliable they are at that. And that's where scouting comes in. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with some of these scouting methods. Pit scouting, where you go around and ask teams stuff about their robot. We have the two types of match scouting, which I think takes up the bulk of what teams do. Qualitative scouting of subjective traits, and quantitative scouting of the hard stats, like how many balls did the robot score? Did they hang at the end? And all the different methods have strengths and limitations. Because limitation of pit scouting obviously is you don't necessarily know how a certain robot trait correlates to performance. Qualitative scouting is highly dependent on the scouters. And quantitative scouting is very, very useful and takes up, I think, the bulk of what, and can be used for the bulk of what teams need. But the data that teams get is often quite inaccurate. And this is when numerical scouting is really helpful because we're using data that's sort of like absolutely true. This is the data that gets like scored by refs. So there's no what happens if my scout wasn't paying attention for a minute. It can also help if you don't have enough scouters to scout every match. And it can be used to supplement or sometimes replace quantitative scouting data. The big limitation here is that a lot of the data is tracked per alliance instead of per robot, just due to how FLC matches work. And so I'll be spending the most of the rest of this workshop talking about how we can use this alliance track data to estimate individual teams' contributions. So a dive into the FLC Event API. I talked about how matches have these score breakdowns. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the scoreboard at the end of each match. If you've ever looked at the bottom, they sort of break down stuff like power cell points and control panel points. These are the same breakdowns that are posted on the Blue Alliance match web pages. The Blue Alliance shows even more breakdowns. You can see initiation line exited per team, endgame action per team, and power cell breakdowns by lower, inner, and outer. The big thing to note here is that auto and endgame actions are tracked per team. So you can go to the Blue Alliance for any match, and you can know like which robot did which robot hanged or which robot parked. However, for all the other stuff, it's tracked for the whole alliance, so you don't know which team shot an auto, or which team did the control panel. And okay, so how to get to this data? The two easiest ways. So first post this stuff, and they have their own API. It's sort of hard to use, but luckily the Blue Alliance helps us. They have their own API, which is a lot easier for people to use. Specifically for this data, you want the event code matches endpoint. An example is shown at doublealliance.com, API v3 events. This is for LA North. If you're not familiar with using APIs, I have a Google Sheet that I post each year that pulls this data and just dumps it into a Google Sheet. So you can take that, download it as a CSV, and use it for anything you need. The spreadsheet also calculates various OPRs and averages, which I'll dive into more. I didn't want to get too much into the details of how exactly to use an API, but basically it's just a web page, and there's like all the data is listed in the JSON dump there. You can just like grab it and use it for whatever you need. So, oops. Averages and OPRs. So this is when we really get into the exciting stuff. So I mentioned how several things are tracked per team. For example, in most years, this is just auto movement and endgame action. This could change in the future, but I think these are the stuff that refs track individually per team. So we're likely to continue seeing this in the future. This is really cool because it means one of two things. It means that either you don't have to scout this stuff because you know it for sure anyway, or it means that you can still scout it and then use this data to double check that your scouters were paying attention during the match. It's not perfect, of course, but my general rule of thumb is that if a scouter missed both auto and endgame, the rest of their data is probably not accurate because those are the easiest things to do. To the right is a screenshot from my spreadsheet showing how you can just grab this data and just get a straight average. So what percentage of team times did a team move or climb? OPR is a bit more complicated. So I talked about how most of the data is tracked per alliance and not per team. But that's not a very useful statistic to have, I guess. Because when it comes to match strategy or alliance selection, you really need to know what each team is capable of. So this is where OpR comes in, and it's a way to estimate the contributions of each team from their alliances scores. So it takes the simple assumption that each team scores the same number of points each match. And so you can say that the OPRs of the 3 teams on the red alliance is equal to that alliance's score, and the same for the blue alliance. And then if you repeat that for every match that's been played, you get a series of equations that's overdefined, meaning like there is no, like there's variation between teams' performances, so their OPR, their actual like contribution between matches will vary. But OPR is the least square solution, which in simple words is just sort of the best fit line through all this data. It is the estimated contribution of each team such that the OPRs most closely sum to alliances scores for every match. The Blue Alliance has a really good blog post that digs more into this and the matrix math behind it. The sort of, I guess, intuitive grasp is if you have like noisy data and you've ever had to draw a best fit line through it, this is basically what we're doing. Except there's more than just X and Y. But it's really the same idea. And something to note is that I say like red score and blue score, but you can really do this with any score breakdown that's in the API. So not just like total points, but like, for example, you can do it with the Teleop balls, lower, inner, and outer. And that is what we sort of call COPR, or component OPRs, using the score breakdowns. So OPR itself, which uses match points, sort of gives you a like rough estimate, I guess, of how good teams are, but it's not altogether that useful, and it's like really, really noisy. COPR, which uses score breakdowns, are on the other hand very useful. Like I said, because you can use stuff, anything that's in the score breakdowns, you get a lot more fidelity, and it can help you pick out trends that are harder to see. So for example, you can really start to see in the data to the right which teams shoot in auto. It can also be useful for stuff that is either impossible to see the scout, like inner goals in 2020, or near impossible to count, like fuel in 2017. COPR is especially accurate for things that not every team does. So for example, inner goals in auto in 2020, or like fuel in 2017. It's less accurate for stuff that either teams do a lot or there's a lot of noise in their data. So like in 2019, the effect like COPR was slightly less useful just because there was so much defense. The team's performances varied a lot between matches. In 2018, it was by far the least useful because scoring a cube didn't necessarily correlate directly to match points. But in most games, and it's useful for at least some metrics. Some definitely more so than others. 2020 was definitely one of the better years for COPR. And it's about as accurate as an average team scouting, with a huge asterisk here. Like I said, it really depends on the actual metric. But COPR is surprisingly accurate, and team scouting data is surprisingly inaccurate. So it works out pretty well. Yeah, I get this question a lot, which is how accurate is COPR? So I wanted to dive a bit more into this. 8 teams graciously allowed me to use the LA North scouting data. I guess as a quick point of reference, 6 of these teams were alliance captains or first picks. So the scouting data, I think, would trend above the average accuracy just because they're more likely to need to use it than an average team. This is the results that I got from auto balls high, so inner and outer combined. The OPL was done by calculating summing the auto balls outer and auto balls inner from these columns, and compare that against what team scouted, which was just all high goals. I then rescouted all these matches to get sort of the, I guess, truth values to check how much error there was in team scouting. So on average, the teams are off by about a quarter of a ball per team. This was over all this is like the average of all the qualification matches. So that's pretty good. OPR was slightly better than this, actually. It was at 0.25 instead of 0.26. This is using what I call OPR 0 adjusted, which is if the team scouting data say that the scouted value was 0, that is, like they never made a high goal shot in any of their qualification matches, then I set the OPR to 0. The reason for this is it's very easy for scouters to know when teams are not scoring. So I think every team that said a team that like never made a high goal shot was correct. This also includes like teams that are like robots that are just incapable of shooting high goals. But OPR is like surprisingly bad at figuring that out. And there's like just a lot of noise down at the very low end. However, even just straight OPR was pretty good. I think it was at like 0.36 or 0.37 error on average. And this I think is really the strength of COPR. For stuff that teams tend to do consistently every match, most teams would try and run the same auto, or if they didn't, they would run an auto that would get them a similar number of points. And there's also less effects from defense or other things that happen during the course of a match, which is a large source of noise in Teleop OPRs. Even then, so this is from Teleop balls high. It's still pretty good, although from the data set I had, it was less accurate than all of the team scouting data. I think on average, so a big disclaimer here, which is I didn't scout every Teleop match. I just used the most accurate team's data, and then compared all the other data against it. So there may have been some bias here. But all the other teams were off by about half a ball per team. And OPR was about 3/4. So, and this is like, I guess the OPR, it's slightly better for teams that are more consistent between their matches, but it isn't a huge trend just because their alliance partners has such a huge effect. There are definitely teams where OPR was significantly more accurate than scouting. There's also teams where scouting was like OPR was just very off. There's no super good way to like look at OPR and know whether it's good or bad. My personal rule of thumb is that if I look at an OPR breakdown and a team has like a really high component OPR but a low average in scouting, then it like sort of triggers a red flag, and I like look into the team further. But in general, I would say component OPR is good for roughly binning teams. So you can be like, these are like the top, I don't know, 5 or 10 teams, and then you can look at scouting data to sort of rank within that. Yeah, so you just gotta use COPR. If your concern is data accuracy, which I assume is the concern of most teams, surprisingly, the best way, well, maybe not surprisingly, but by far the best way to make it more accurate is to work with other teams and average your scouting data. So the results that I got by just taking the 8 teams scouting data, averaging it per team, and then discarding the largest outlier, reduced the error in auto from 0.26 to 0.15 balls per team, and similarly for Teleop, down to just under a third ball per team. So I think a lot of the scouting error is like teams have is just noise. So the more other teams' data you get, the less effect like any one scouter's error has. If you have a really large team and a really large scouting team, a similar way you can do this is to just double scout every team and average. But the more data you get, the better. The trend held even if I excluded the most accurate team's data from the set. And if I did that, the average of the scouting data was actually more accurate than any individual teams. So that was pretty interesting. If that's not an option available to you, I would compare COPR and scouting data. If there's a huge difference and they're match videos, you can rescout those matches. And if not, you can just have those teams as a team to more closely watch the next day. So where would you actually use COPR instead of scouting? Like I mentioned in the earlier slide, you can use it for stuff you either can't see or count, so integrals and fuel. If you have a limited scouting team, you can use COPR to help narrow down which teams to focus on. So if you are, for example, only interested in teams that can shoot high goals, you can take that component OPR, maybe take like the top half and then just scout those. If you have no scouting data at all, and you somehow end up as an alliance captain and you need to make a pick list, COPR is way better than team rank for determining which team to pick. It's also a lot better than just regular OPR. So you can make a decently good pick list, I think, just using a couple of component breakdowns and like endgame, like how often do they hang. Definitely not something I would recommend, but I would say it isn't terrible. And finally, it's very useful for pre-scouting teams, especially at champs when there's several events worth of data to look at. Like I said, it's good for binning teams, and that's really what you're sort of doing in pre-scouting. So it can help you figure out which teams you want to focus on, especially if you're not planning on manually pre-scouting every team. So what are some other, I guess, variations on COPR that people have done to make it fancier and try and make it more accurate? I touched on this in some of the earlier slides, but a huge source of error in COPR is the teams that don't score at all. This is also like by far the easiest thing to scout because it's really easy to say a team like never scored a point. But just like due to how OPR is solved, you just get a lot of noise around there. You also often, so the way regular OPR is calculated, you can also get negative points, which can throw things off. My like rough solution for that is to just treat a negative value as 0, because you can't like really score negative balls per match. Doesn't make any sense. But one thing you can do is you can sort of modify the OPR's equation. And if you know a team can't shoot high goal, for example, you can just like feed into the equation that value is 0. There wasn't a huge increase in accuracy from this. I don't have a lot of data on it. But in general, I would say just treating a negative OPR as 0 isn't much worse than trying to change COPR. something that does have a fairly large effect, but I don't have enough data to quantify it, is to combine scouting data in. So the simplest way to do this is, we talked about how the OPI equation takes like assumes that like the 3 teams on the red alliances OPRs sums to their alliance score. From your scouting data, you know that red one, like the first team's OPR should be equivalent to like the value that you scouted. And it's true for like every team in every match. So if you feed all of this in together, you get what's essentially a combination like of COPRs based on alliance results, and scouting data, which is scouted per team. And that can be quite interesting because it helps to mitigate the effect that like scouters errors have on the scores, since it takes into account the alliance scores. But it also helps to account for like what is often a huge variation in team performances between matches. If you have read Citrus Circuit's white paper, which I highly recommend if you hadn't, there's a lot of cool stuff in there. The way they calculate inner goals is related to this. They're solving, so instead of just solving for a straight inner goal OPR, they called it percentage of inner goals per high goal. And then they created, and their formulation is like that percentage multiplied by the number of high goals that they scouted for that team. You sum that for the 3 teams on the alliance, and that value should equal to the number of inner goals that alliance made. The assumption there is that there's more variation in how many balls teams score per match than there is in like how often they make a inner goal. So you can do stuff like this that can really help capture more of the variation between matches, which I think is really the biggest weakness of OPR. Like, because the basic assumption is that teams score the same in every match, which if you look at scanning data is really not that good of an assumption. Taking into account scanning data can really help. I guess the flip side of this is if you're trying to like predict what a team is going to do in the future, the average is actually pretty good. So even if OPR isn't that good at telling you like exactly how many points a team scored in the past, it is good at telling you how many points they'll score in the future. And now I come to a couple of other stuff. ELO, which has become really popular in recent years, DPR, and CCWM. So ELO, which comes from chess rankings, is a way of ranking teams relative to each other. So it takes teams ELOs going into a match, the opponent's ELOs going into a match, and figures out how much they think the one alliance should win by. And then based on how much they actually win, and if you beat that margin, you get pushed up in ELO, and if you do worse than that, get shifted down. ELO is really, really good at getting relative rankings, which is like really what it's meant for. So I think First Updates Now uses that in their top 25 stuff. If you wanted to just know like what was the best team at champs, or like what was the best team in a given year, ELO would definitely be what I would use. For scanning specifically, it's a bit less useful. ELO doesn't have any like concrete meaning. So if you say a team has an ELO of, you know, like like 1600 or something, like it doesn't mean a whole lot in and of itself. And it definitely doesn't mean anything to, like, you can't take that and know how many high goals did they score on average. So COPR sort of correlates directly to this like data sets to replace scouting data. ELO is, I guess you could use it. Like if a team had an especially high ELO and wasn't showing up as like doing particularly well in any score breakdown, that could be a flag. But in general, I wouldn't focus on it for scouting. DPR, so OPR stands for offensive power rating. I guess I just said that earlier. DPR is defensive power rating, but it's really not a useful calculation. So OPR takes the assumption that like the team's OPS sum to their score, their alliance's score. DPR does the opposite. It uses the opponent's score, and it says that if an opponent scores fewer points, then your defensive ability is higher because you prevented them from making points. In reality, this like just isn't a useful metric. It's basically just noise. DPS doesn't really correlate at all to which teams actually play defense, and definitely doesn't correlate well to teams that play effective defense. If there's a way to, I guess, capture defense just from numbers, it's going to need a lot more data, maybe zebra dot location data or something else. Instead, what I would do is just have scouters mark if teams are playing defense. If you're a team that doesn't have enough scouters and you're using COPR instead of scouting every team, the stuff that I would say to focus on for the scouters would be, are they playing defense? Are they committing fouls? Like that kind of stuff, the stuff that's really very hard to capture in any other way. And CCWM is calculated contribution to the winning margin. I think it's sort of fallen out of popularity, which in my opinion is a very good thing because it's a combination of OPR and DPR. And as I said, OPR is like sort of varying usefulness, and DPR is really not useful. So CCWM is just a worse OPR in my opinion. And I think the drop-off of its use is sort of a testament to that. All right, so let's sped through my slides. Not sure if there are any questions. I hope some of that was useful. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was incredible. I definitely learned a lot. We actually do have a couple of questions from the Twitch stream, and I also have a couple of questions for you. So actually, could you stop presenting your screen?
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Sweet. So the first question that we have, I think this is like a good introduction. So this is from Alice Chu. And the question is, what is API and how do you get component OPR data? I think I'll change that a little and ask, like, what's your go-to for getting your component OPR data? Do you have like your own scripts, or do you use like a pre-made custom solution or a pre-made solution out there?
Yeah. Okay. So the API is, I guess, sort of where first stores all this data. APIs themselves are just sort of a way to get data, I guess, like from a web page. So like, you can write a script and grab all of this data, as opposed, I guess, to like going to the blue lines and like having to manually transcript each match, which would be kind of a pain. There are a bunch, if you're not familiar with using APIs, I think there are a bunch of people who have written libraries. So there's, I think like the simplest would be their Google Sheet scripts. So you can just, they can like grab the different the Blue Lines endpoints. There's also stuff for Python and Java and so on. Personally, I make the spreadsheet each year because it's kind of a pain to like keep writing scripts to do the same stuff. My spreadsheet has like 2 tabs. The first tab just grabs all of the match breakdowns and dumps that into just a sheet. And the second, calculates component OPRs. So because COPRs is just a least squares estimation, which is something that like I think every programming language has functions for. What you really just need, what's the best way to explain this? You're forming the equations that I mentioned and then basically making them into matrices and then plugging those into a least squares formulation. I would recommend reading the Blue Lines' blog post, which I think can explain this a lot better than I can like on air now.
Do you have a link that we can share later on with a link to your Google sheet? I think you mentioned
it is in the slides, so I can share the
awesome.
slides later.
Great. Okay, yeah, we'll publish those slides after the event, so y'all can take a look at them and explore Rachel's sheets. And actually, a shout out to like a library I have. It's FRC Stat. You can find it on GitHub, but that also spits out component OPR data if you know Python for every year, and that doesn't need to be updated. So there are a couple of different solutions that people can use to get component OPR data out there. Rachel's is like I think by far the easiest though.
There's a lot of stuff out there, so I would definitely take a look. I think there's now a website too. I'm not sure if they have component OPRs, but I know they definitely have ELOs.
Oh, the site made by the 5511, I think.
Yeah.
They have something.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different stuff out there. I think if you just go on Chief Delphi, maybe search like OPR, component OPR, you'll find a whole bunch of different resources.
Yeah. And actually, I think a follow-up from that person, they also asked, is component OPR based off of the API data?
Yes. So it uses the different score breakdowns from the API for the different metrics.
Okay. The next question we have, so Elise, Chu, if you have more questions, feel free to ask them and we'll get to them. So the next question we have is from, I don't think I can, I don't even know if this is a name. It's NLSNGRN. That's their Twitch username. But they said when you zero the non-scoring team, does that just add to all the teams? So I think I actually had a similar question if I'm understanding this correctly. But like when you zero score it, right? Do you like put that back into the matrix and then redo your component OPR math?
Okay. So there's sort of 2 ways. I guess the simpler way would be to just solve it regularly. And then if something comes up negative, you just treat it as 0 for the basis of like how much is the team actually scoring. You can also, so there are ways to solve least squares with constraints. So it basically says this score has to be 0 and then find the solution for every other team, which I guess since it's 0, it's sort of the equivalent of like leaving that team out of the equation. So instead of having like 3 teams that sum to a score, it's really just the 2 teams that actually scored. It's a little bit more complicated than it just pushes teams OPS up. I think a big reason for that is currently you're getting a lot of negative OPS. So I've come for that. But yes, I guess if you have to think about it, it's like if you leave data out of, it's all the idea of like drawing a best fit line, and if you leave some data out, the best fit line will change. So I guess short answer is yes, longer answer is it's more complicated.
That makes sense. I'd be very interested in, I enjoyed seeing that like where you had the different like actual data from LA North in your component OPR and seeing like the error there. That was really cool to see. I think I'd also be interested in seeing like how the error changes based off of like what measurement method you use, right? Like if you just set negative numbers to 0 or, try to like resolve it with that constraint.
Yeah, I hesitated to do that with this just because it's like so little data that I didn't want people to take like too much stock into what I was getting from just a single event. But yeah, there are some cool stuff you can do for sure.
That makes sense. Actually, like another question I had was, have you like tried the zero scoring method for like other games? I'm trying to think of like a good example in my head, but like I guess Boulders in 2016, right? Or
Yeah.
Fuel in
Um,
2017.
yeah, fuel was the big one. So I think so fuel is sort of a very interesting thing to look at just because at an average regional, you're getting like maybe 2 or 3 teams that were consistently scoring like noticeable amounts of fuel. Um, so that really stood out in the COPRs because you could just be like, if everyone was getting like a -1 to a 1 and suddenly you had a team that had like 50, then you'd be like, oh, this is like the one team that's like scoring fuel. Um, but yeah, you can solve that through zero, which does account for a lot of noise in that particular case, just because so many teams weren't scoring fuel. Um, I don't think I've tried it with boulders specifically, but I would say that's probably very similar to balls in 2020. Um, it's also roughly equivalent to like hatch panels in cargo in 2019. Um, it's sort of unfortunate that I guess in the past few games we've had 2017 with the gears and 2018 with the cubes that both scored non-linearly. So
Yeah,
OPR is not very useful there.
agreed. That introduces some like interesting things with yeah it's because it's not linear.
Mhm.
I think another good question that we just got from NLS and GRN is how soon in a competition do you trust your OPR data?
Oh, yeah, I should talk more about this. This is a really good question. So OPR can't be solved until every team's played at least one match. Um, just, I guess, like, just due to like how the equations are formulated. I would say it's not that accurate until teams have played at least like about half of the matches that they're going to play. So maybe like 5 to 6, depending on your regional or district event. Um, Part of the reason for this is teams' performances in the early matches really varies a lot. I think that's when teams try and like that's when they find mistakes and they tune stuff. Um, and so a performance in like the first match is not necessarily that indicative of a performance in a later match. The other thing is just like you need a certain number of matches for OPR to converge, and that doesn't happen. I would say until probably about 5 or 6 matches in. Um,
That's an interesting point you've made about like the first match is not usually indicative of a team's performance. Have you like ever looked into like omitting the first match from OPR calculations and seeing how that works? I've never thought about this until right now, actually. So
yes, that's sort of a trade-off because like the less data you have, especially with OPR, stuff can get quite noisy. I was looking at how Islam's performances correlates to qualification matches, and there is it is slightly more correlated to the last half of a team's qualification matches than it is to all of them. Um, with OPR specifically, I think I probably wouldn't leave out the data, but there are ways that you could weight later matches more heavily, which would be something interesting to look into.
oh,
Um,
interesting. Like changing your I guess your square matrix and like
yeah, so the way OPR works right now, like every match has an equivalent effect, um, right?
yeah.
Um,
That,
because it's just the best fit data to the line. But yeah, there are ways to weight the effects of certain matches,
that
which I haven't dug enough into to really um, concretely say whether that's a good thing. But I think it's a
that
direction it could go.
that's a really interesting idea. I haven't thought about that either. Okay. Uh, let's see. So another question I had was if you had a team with like 3 scouters or like not as many, people as a lot of like a lot of teams have, right? It's like a pretty bare bones crew. What would you try to like have the students collect, and what would you like try to derive from your APIs and from like other numerical calculations?
Okay. So I guess I'll start with like my personal experience. So I've never been on a team with like that few scatters. Well, on 5499, I think we actually did use API data in place of autos. And I want to say we had them scout endgame anyway, just because. But we did try and use that to like limit how much data scouters had to collect, because we found that on our team at least, the more data they were trying to scout, the less accurate the data became. For a team with like 3 scouters, I think I would do 2 things. The first is I would definitely, if the team is expecting to be, let's say, an alliance captain, I would definitely have someone scout things like defense, I guess like big red flags. So like if a team is like always committing a lot of fouls, that'll be, because it's easy. It's a lot easier, I think, to do not pick teams than there's to sort of like figure out which teams you do want to pick. So getting those stuff out of the way is good. I would probably, for 3 scouters, have them scout like just one alliance. So like always just scout, say, the blue alliance or the red alliance. You would only get like half of the scouting data, but just like by chance you should be getting a decent amount of data per team. And then I would at that point weight component OPR more heavily. So if your scouting data says a team is averaging like 2 balls per match and COPR is saying like 7, then as that team, I would say on the last day, like take a much longer look at that team where the discrepancy is high.
Okay, so it sounds like your suggestion is like, try to get your humans to like get a little bit of data, but then try to like error check that with component OPR.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't like, if at all possible, I would still have human scout, just to try and catch things that OPR is missing. But you can use OPR to help you figure out which teams to scout, I guess.
Okay, that makes sense. That seems like a good idea. We have another question from Twitch from that same user, NLSNGRN. I have to learn how to say that one day. But I think it's kind of like a follow-up to like our discussion earlier with like, omitting the first match. I think they're saying separating OPR by day. Do you think that might be like a good idea in like a calculation or?
So I guess personally, like teams I've been on use like the first. So like because the last day you sort of like have a half day and then elimination matches, right? The teams I've been on do them like pick list the night before, which I think is what most teams do. So that's like really the point when we use OPR. So it is, I guess, leaving out the last days of data. And then we focus like on the very last day, those last few matches, we really focused more on, okay, we already have a pick list. Do we need to shift this around at all? Is there a team that maybe broke or like finally tuned their shooter, that kind of stuff? Breaking it down per day, beyond that, I'm not sure it would have that much statistical value. I think when it comes down to trying to solve OPR with like 3 matches, it's not really that useful of a metric. You could definitely look at things like, for example, hangs, which you can accurately get per team. It's like if a team got a 50% hang rate, but all of those were in the last half of the matches, then like they probably maybe they mounted their shooter, or maybe like they figured out something that was wrong with it. Sorry, they mounted their climber, or they figured out something that was wrong with it.
So yeah. For like binary things, it sounds like it might be an easier thing to like try to do, like, separate it by day or something like that.
Yeah, at that point, it's really just sort of like looking at your scouting data. And I'm sure like if you made a pick list, like if a team like is trending upwards, that's like a much better sign than if the team is trending downwards, or like, I don't know, sinusoidally.
That makes sense. I think we have one more question from, we figured out their name. Their name is Nelson. So for so many parameters for COPR, do you have a parameter reduction that you like? So this seems like a more in-depth question. So like principal components, clustering, or stuff like that to see which ones are creating largest variation. I'm still trying to deconstruct the
Grading?
question. Yeah, so
Grading. So like which ones have the most effect on like team performances overall? Is that
I think so. Do you do any like parameter reduction? I think is what they're trying to get at.
I'm
So,
not
so
quite sure what they mean by parameter reduction.
I'm not 100% sure either. So maybe we can get a clarification on that. I think we actually have another question. So in the meantime, this is from Elise Chu. So API and OpR data is for quantitative data only, right?
Yeah. So yeah, it's the hard data that you can get from the API. So yeah, it is like sort of you can use it to supplement or in place of the quantitative scouting data.
Okay. I think we're actually almost out of time. On that last question, I think like what they're probably trying to get at is if you could try to like cluster your API data, right? So like, let's just say this is like ball scored and you see like a bunch of points down here and a bunch of points up there. I guess, is that something that like you've looked into, or do you think it's even worth looking into? Or do you think that like variation plays into like what your select component OPR should be?
So I think the biggest I guess the biggest challenge with OPR just is the limited data. So stuff like clustering, I think some people have looked into in the past and haven't gotten like that definite results. This was, I guess, related to like what are like the other ways you can sort of tweak OPR, and it's just really hard just due to how few matches and how much noise there is. Um, if that question meant something completely different and it was like, how do I decide which component OPS to use? Because that was how I interpreted it at first. I just do it based on like, what is the data we would have scouted? And then instead of scouting that, figure out what score breakdown that correlates to and how can we find OPR for it.
Okay, that makes sense. I think we're out of time today. Thank you so
Okay.
much, Rachel. I
Thank
definitely
you.
learned a lot, and I enjoyed our discussion. I'm excited to see like what you do next on Chief Delphi and like what sort of inspiration you give to the rest of that first community. So
Thanks.
thank you
It's
so
really
much,
fun
Rachel.
being here. Thank you.